In 1791, the newly formed United States government, under President George Washington, imposed the first federal excise tax on distilled spirits. This was enacted to help pay off the country's Revolutionary War debts, which was substantial. This immediately angered many of the immigrant farmers, most of whom were Scots-Irish and were war veterans themselves in the Appalachia region of the country. The practice of distilling alcohol was brought to the U.S. by the descendants of these Scots-Irish immigrants in the early part of the century. For these farmers, distilling excess crops like corn, apples, and peaches into whiskey or brandy was a practical necessity. In addition to reducing wasted products, it was often more feasible and profitable to transport crops to market in the concentrated, higher-value form of alcohol. In some counties, alcohol was even used as a currency. Many felt betrayed after fighting for this newly formed republic, only to be taxed basically on their livelihood. And if there's one thing Americans hate, if you don't already know by now, it's being taxed. To which I say, hey, freedom isn't free, right? But anyway, this defiance led to an armed and sometimes violent uprising that came to be known as the Whiskey Rebellion. In one particularly violent clash, 400 rebels looted and set fire to the home of a regional tax collector in Pittsburgh. It was eventually quelled after Washington sent some 13,000 militia troops into the region and marked the first time federal troops were used against its own citizens. This event also began a long and deep-seated resentment towards revenuers, the government officials in charge of collecting taxes. The unpopular tax was eventually repealed a decade later by Thomas Jefferson, but it wasn't the last time the government tried to regulate alcohol in the country. You're listening to the Significantly Trivial Podcast. I'm your host, Rome. Ah, yes, one of my favorite things to indulge in or just talk about, alcohol. I swear I don't have a problem, though. I enjoy a nice glass of Syrah with a meal, or sipping on an old-fashioned, or even just a well-crafted brewski. And so do a lot of other people. But I was reading the other day that alcohol consumption in the U.S., at least, is at its lowest in 90 years. And this is especially the case for the younger generations. And you know what? That's great for them. You always hear how harmful alcohol is to your body. But back in my day, for me and my friends, we couldn't wait to be adults and go to the bar or the clubs. And that got me to thinking, and in this holiday season when many of us will be indulging in some type of potent potable, led me to this episode's trivia question. This nocturnal phrase is used to describe illegally processed alcohol that helped give birth to one of the most popular sports in America. If you're joining us for the first time, this podcast takes a seemingly trivial piece of information, something many would consider useless or insignificant, and peels back the layers to reveal a deeper meaning and importance. Why? Because no matter how trivial it may seem, everything you know is important. It doesn't matter what it is, at one point you found it important enough, interesting enough that you decided to remember it. And that's all that should matter. So if you love trivia like me, you've found the right place. And the answer to the trivia question is moonshine. The origins of the word date back all the way to the 17th century, earlier even if you take its figurative meaning. But in this context, it means any activity that is done at night by moonlight to avoid detection and scrutiny. And here, that activity was distilling alcohol. The history of moonshine is intimately tied to the history of America. And while its roots are from Scotland and Ireland, its legacy is strictly American and will forever be linked to its culture, music, and folklore. There's so much to unpack here, from its history to its link to a uniquely American tradition, all the way to the current landscape of modern craft distilleries. So have a seat in a nice comfy chair and pour yourself a glass of your favorite spirit, and let's talk about the often turbulent history of alcohol in America and how it played a major role in the creation of one of the country's most popular sports and pastimes. So, after the Whiskey Rebellion and the repeal of the alcohol tax in the late 18th century, America went through some growing pains. There was still lots of fighting and bickering with England that resulted in some armed conflicts like the War of 1812 and some of the regional Indian wars. At this time, too, the country grew tremendously, mostly in part to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This agreement basically doubled the size of the country and resulted in the westward push of settlers and pioneers into the frontier, and often resulted in clashes with the native tribes that inhabited those lands. Many of these settlers brought with them whiskey and the practice of making it. And while several of the native tribes were already capable of making their own fermented alcohol drinks, these were mostly used ceremoniously and of lower potency. Once they were introduced to the more potent whiskeys and drinking for the fun of it, well, let's just say it wasn't a good thing. It was believed that some government officials even used the liquor to soften them up, the tribal leaders, before signing away their lands. Sounds about right. Alcohol became a valuable commodity in the Indian territories. It was traded for high-value furs, resources, and even land. For the native population, its usage was no longer limited to the ritualistic purposes. Influenced by the pioneers' binge drinking, it was purely for enjoyment and habit now. Yeehaw! It soon became apparent the damages it was causing. Concerned about the fatal effects of liquor on tribes, then President Thomas Jefferson authorized the first federal laws to prevent or restrain the vending or distributing of spirituous liquors among native tribes. In addition, the newly formed Bureau of Indian Affairs was partly created to enforce prohibition in Indian country. Despite these efforts, many of the laws were broken and simply ignored. Out on the frontier, it was very difficult to enforce these and really any laws. It wasn't called the Wild West for nothing. Bootleggers, as they would be called, would smuggle the illegal whiskey by hiding it in their tall boots. For them, the money was too great and the risks were worth taking. This is actually something new I learned. I never knew the word's origin, but yeah, that's where the term bootlegger comes from. Back in the East, this growth sparked heated discussions and debates regarding the direction and future of the country. Government leaders were split into two camps. The Federalists, who were led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, wanted a strong central government, a national bank, and a manufacturing-based economy modeled after Britain and other European nations. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, feared a strong central government and wanted to limit government overreach. They envisioned a republic of virtue, made up of independent states consisting of small farms. Now, if you paid attention in history class, you can probably see where this is heading. But since this episode is not about the ensuing conflict known as the Civil War, I'll skip to the era just following it and how, once again, the federal government needed to pay for all the debt and damages resulting from the conflict. Near the end of the war, the Internal Revenue Service was created with the task of collecting taxes to help pay for and finance the country. One of the taxes enacted, or reenacted in this case, was the federal liquor tax. This didn't go too well with an already pissed-off South, whose primary agricultural income was still supplemented with alcohol production. This resulted in an unprecedented rise in illegal stills and moonshine operations. But this was just a prelude to further regulation and ultimately the complete banning of alcohol production. Several factors contributed to prohibition in the United States. Towards the end of the 19th century, the evangelical movement experienced its second Great Awakening, the first occurring in the decades just prior to American independence. Evangelical groups viewed alcohol as a moral poison, corrupting and inhibiting a person from leading a good Christian life. And many believed it was the government's moral duty to regulate and legislate sobriety. A target for the religious agenda was saloon culture. Saloons were places where one could indulge in drinking and socializing. But they were also places to engage in ungodly acts such as dancing, gambling, and listen to music, and just overall having a fun time. Alcohol and its effects were becoming an issue too. We all know that alcohol can bring out the absolute worst in a person. Some of the issues attributed to it were crime, domestic abuse, and the deterioration of the American family and American values. But now, in addition to the religious groups and temperance groups such as the Women's Temperance Union, who fought against domestic abuses and child neglect, business and industry leaders began to see the harm alcohol can cause to the American workforce, such as workplace accidents and decreased productivity. A sober worker is a more productive worker. Many of these groups funded early scientific studies into the negative effects of alcohol, labeling it as a biological poison, and led to the introduction of health education in public schools. Sure, some of the results were exaggerated, but everyone started to see the dangers of it, even back then. Perhaps the most interesting movement in the push to ban alcohol came from the ASL, the Anti-Saloon League. One of the most effective lobbying groups in U.S. history, it championed all of the above causes, but also argued that saloons were breeding grounds for government corruption and fomenting rebellion and revolt. Their single-minded approach to politics meant that any politician supporting their agenda had their full backing, no matter what else they believed in. At around this time, too, America entered the Great War, World War I. The enemy, of course, was Germany, and many of the breweries in America, Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, were owned by German Americans. Government officials urged boycotting these companies, pushing the belief that spending money on their product aided the enemy. The war effort also called for the reappropriation of grain towards food supplies for troops rather than the unnecessary use for beer and spirits. And finally, in 1913, the U.S. government ratified the 16th Amendment, which created the income tax system and granted the federal government the power to collect taxes from individuals and corporations based on income. Prior to this, the government relied heavily on the alcohol excise tax, which generated nearly 40% of the revenue for the country. But now, with the new income tax in place, it provided a new permanent source of revenue, making it financially possible for the government to finally kill the cash cow of alcohol taxes. So, in 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919 and effectively banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. And in 1920, Congress passed the Volstead Act, which provided the specific legal definitions and enforcement power for the amendment, thus beginning the age of Prohibition in America. But it seems that the federal government didn't learn a thing from their previous efforts to regulate alcohol. Because while prohibition was intended to improve the moral fiber and health of the nation, it did nearly the exact opposite and serves as a perfect example of the law of unintended consequences. It proved to be the single greatest catalyst for the moonshine industry, creating unprecedented demand and profitability. Small-scale moonshiners transformed into massive organized criminal enterprises. Without a doubt, prohibition was the main cause for the rise of national crime syndicates. Small criminal gangs now had a common goal: to work together and play their part in the production and distribution of illegal liquor throughout the entire country, to get their share, their cut of the operations. It was during Prohibition and because of it that saw the rise of America's most famous gangster, Scarface himself, Al Capone. His Chicago outfit was a major player in the illegal alcohol industry, of course among other nefarious activities, overseeing the smuggling of liquor across state lines into cities and urban centers. Production of moonshine, however, still centered mostly around the rural, mountainous regions like the Ozarks and Appalachia, away from the prying eyes of the government and authorities. And it was still produced in much the same way it has been for over a century, only on a much larger scale now.
It's according to what your slop is, according to how much liquor you're gonna make. If you got good beer, or mash, or slop, or whatever you want to call it, well, you'll have some good liquor. Your liquor's not made in the still, it's made in the barrel. If your mash ain't no good, your liquor ain't no good.
Have you ever heard of the terms white lightning or ruckus juice? How about firewater or rot gut? Well, they all describe the same thing, moonshine. At its most basic, it is an unaged whiskey and really only requires 4 ingredients: cornmeal, sugar, water, and yeast. Now, you're probably wondering, wait a minute, I thought whiskey is a brown color. Well, the color of whiskey comes from the aging process. The color, flavor, and aromas are achieved from the oak barrels it's usually aged in. So, because moonshine is unaged, it stays clear. But it's not clear for the same reasons as vodka or gin. They all basically start with the fermentation process. The base material differs. For whiskey, it starts with the fermented grain mash like corn, barley, or rye, whereas vodka can also be made from potatoes or beets. The key difference is in the post-distillation process. Instead of being aged, vodka goes through a filtration process. This removes any impurities, making it as clean and neutral as possible, which is the goal. Gin actually starts off as a vodka, but goes through an additional infusion process which adds flavors like juniper berries and citrus. Finally, it is redistilled after this infusion. So, going back to the process, it starts with fermentation. This breaks down the starches in the grains or fruits into sugars. The yeast then converts it into alcohol. This basic fermenting mixture is called a mash. The next step separates the alcohol, essence, or spirit from the water by heating the fermented liquid to a certain temperature. The resulting vapor is then converted back to a liquid by being cooled in an apparatus called a still. The goal is to achieve a spirit with a high proof. You've probably heard or seen that term before. It usually appears on bottles of liquor, and it's used to indicate the alcohol content of the spirit. Whiskeys are usually around 80 proof, and it's not a direct 1-to-1 ratio of alcohol. The rule is proof is roughly double the alcohol percentage, so 80 proof is 40% alcohol. It dates all the way back to 16th century England and was used for taxation purposes. Stronger spirits with a higher alcohol content were taxed higher, and a method to prove the alcohol content was to set a flame to the spirit. If it burned with a blue flame, it was proof that there was sufficient alcohol content and was considered 100 proof. If it didn't ignite, it proved to have less alcohol and was watered down and less pure. Now, this whole process requires a lot of conditions to be just right to achieve the best product. Unfortunately, when it came to moonshine, the conditions it was created in were minimal at best, which resulted in an inferior and often dangerous product. Due to its illegal and unregulated production, the environment and the materials used in the production were substandard at best. Makeshift stills and condensers were made from salvaged automotive and railroad parts containing lead and many other dangerous materials like methanol. Chronic consumption of the tainted moonshine resulted in blindness, mental diseases, and renal failures, among other conditions, and led to the many creative names for the spirit, like rotgut and skullcracker. And, in a very controversial move to discourage bootlegging, the U.S. government ordered the denaturing of industrial alcohol with additional poisons, knowing full well that it was being redistilled by moonshiners. This unethical practice was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 10,000 Americans. So now that we know how shine is made, I want to switch gears now and talk about the interesting connection moonshine has with the uniquely American motorsport called NASCAR. There's a saying that goes, NASCAR was born in the back of a whiskey car. In order to transport the illegal liquor from the distilleries in the rural backwoods to the urban markets, moonshiners needed vehicles that could outrun federal agents. These whiskey cars looked like any other stock car. This was actually desired. They didn't want to stand out, they wanted to blend in with all the other vehicles. On the inside, though, they were anything but stock. Many bootleggers preferred the bigger engines like the Ford V8 and would tune them to make them faster to outrun the authorities when they needed to. They were the OG car tuners, sometimes swapping out engines completely for better performance. Their suspensions, too, were tweaked to handle the heavier load from all the contraband they were hauling without looking like they were hauling contraband. And then there were the drivers. It took a special type of person for the job. Fearless, a little crazy, and someone who knew the backwoods and back roads like the back of their hand. They also developed specialized driving techniques, most notably the bootlegger's turn, or J-turn, a 180-degree turn that would get them out of sticky situations quickly when facing the authorities. It's that famous turn you see in a lot of movies where they reverse and then whip the car around and start racing in the other direction.
Just a good old boy, never meaning no harm. Beats all you never saw, been in trouble with the law since the day they was born.
Well, someone eventually had the brilliant idea of putting together a contest, a race to see who was the best driver out there. And NASCAR was born. What started out as a fun contest for a bunch of good old boys soon grew. Wealthy businessmen who made their fortunes in moonshine began funding and financing these groups, buying the best cars, mechanics, and hiring the best drivers, most of whom honed their skills running shine in the backwoods of North Carolina and Georgia. A man named Raymond Parks is arguably the most important figure in the early days of NASCAR. He was one of the first to spend money on buying the best equipment and hiring the best people, from mechanics to drivers, making him the first NASCAR team owner and eventually winning the first NASCAR championship in 1949. And then there's Junior Johnson. He didn't just happen to moonshine, he was born into it. His family from North Carolina was moonshine. His father's farm was the site of the largest moonshine bust in U.S. history, over 7,000 gallons, sending his father to prison for nearly 20 years. Junior began driving when he was just 8 and was running full loads of White Lightning by the time he was 14. He became a highly skilled driver, and legend has it that he was never caught on the road. He is widely credited for inventing the bootlegger's turn that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes called the J-turn, there is some debate on the origin of the term. Some say it's from the shape the maneuver makes in the dirt. Others say it comes from his name, Junior Johnson, J.J. He was also very intelligent, especially when it came to racing and utilizing what he knew about aerodynamics to gain any and every advantage on the track. He pioneered the technique known as drafting, one of the cornerstones of NASCAR racing techniques still used today. In 1956, Junior was finally caught and arrested, but not for racing and running moonshine, but for starting up his father's still, trying to make illegal alcohol. He served less than a year and was officially fully pardoned by Ronald Reagan in 1986. A legend in moonshine lore and NASCAR history, Junior Johnson was part of the inaugural class of inductees into the NASCAR Hall of Fame in 2010. Prohibition was eventually repealed in 1933. The reasons and causes were many, but for moonshiners it didn't change a thing. If anything, business actually picked up due to the high liquor taxes that were reenacted. For those in the South, they continued their defiant stance against any federal regulation. One such person was Marvin Popcorn Sutton.
I was born and raised on the backside of Ghost Town, Ghost Mountain, on the backside of it, on a place called Hemp Hill, better known as the ice hole of the world. It's right next to the Smoky Mountain National Park.
Perhaps the most famous modern moonshiner, Sutton was a native of Hemp Hill, North Carolina, and the self-proclaimed last real mountain person. A third-generation distiller, he learned from his granddaddy, and up until the early 2000s, continued to do it the exact same way. His is a very interesting story. When you get a chance, read up on him. There's some YouTube videos about him. It really gives you a glimpse into the moonshine culture and is almost like stepping into a time machine. But make sure you have subtitles on for the videos because, man, it was difficult understanding what he was saying sometimes. He really embodied that rebellious Southern persona that took pride in his heritage and his work. He was also known for some really great quotes like, "Jesus turned water into wine, I turned it into liquor." Or, "If lard was common sense, most people couldn't grease a pan." Despite his fame, however, he was arrested in 2009 for illegal production of alcohol, and sadly, he committed suicide before his prison sentence could begin. The legacy of moonshine, however, did not die with him. It's still going strong today, experiencing almost a type of renaissance. Distillers began ditching the illegal stigma to it and embraced the mainstream. Craft distilleries sprang up, and people's tastes began to change and wanted more from their alcohol than the mass-produced stuff. A type of subculture was born and nurtured in the rebirth of speakeasies where mixologists would concoct creative and out-of-this-world cocktails. Liquor was cool and hip again. Also, here's a fun fact. I discovered that the drink Mountain Dew, its origins date back to the early days of moonshine. It was slang for it, and when I thought about it, the name does make sense. Then in the 1940s, it evolved into its own thing as a mixer for the liquor. Its early branding actually used a hillbilly theme with Willie the Hillbilly as its mascot.
Yahoo! Mountain Dew!
I've never tried whiskey with Mountain Dew. The story of moonshine is the story of America. Born out of rebellion, it embodies a uniquely American history of defiance and resourcefulness. We've seen how that defiance survived the era of Prohibition, a time that promised to sober up the nation, but instead gave us the roaring 20s and the rise of organized crime and its iconic bosses. From dusty dirt roads to today's high-speed hippodromes, it gave birth to the heart-pounding spectacle of NASCAR. Moonshine was never just about the alcohol. It was a craft, a survival tactic, and a thumb in the eye of any authority that tried to tax a man's ingenuity. It reminds us that history isn't just found in textbooks. Sometimes it's found in the smell of a corn mash and the light of the full moon. And it's the story of the rebel spirit that refuses to be bottled up. Thanks for joining me, everyone, on this little jaunt through American history. I know a lot of you will be celebrating this holiday season with a glass, or two, or three, of your favorite spirit. Please enjoy it responsibly and have a great, fun time. Join me next time for what should be a different experience. I'm going to try something different in the next episode with what I call my trivia timeout. Instead of just a single trivia question and topic, it'll be a whole bunch of trivia from different topics, but try to find a common theme at the end. After each question, I'll provide an abbreviated summary of each question and its significance. Should be fun. It probably won't be until the new year, though. It's time to celebrate. Till then, from my family and friends to yours, have a Merry Christmas and a happy and safe New Year. Take care, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.